The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo examined the ancient manuscript before him. The weathered pages contained Niccolò Machiavelli's most guarded secrets, not just about ruling others, but about the fundamental transformation required to become truly undefeatable. The opening lines struck him with their brutal clarity: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Lorenzo had inherited his grandfather's business empire at 28, unprepared for the vultures that circled wealth and power. In 18 months, he had watched trusted friends betray him, employees steal from him, and family members plot against him. Each betrayal had taught him a harsh lesson that formal education never could. In the realm of power, mercy is often mistaken for weakness, and kindness can become a weapon in the wrong hands. The manuscript detailed 6 archetypes of people who would inevitably drain one's power, resources, and spirit. Machiavelli's research, drawn from years of observing the rise and fall of princes and republics, revealed a pattern so consistent it bordered on mathematical law. These 6 types appeared in every court, every business, every social circle, and they all shared one common trait: they transformed benefactors into victims through the very act of being rescued. The first archetype, the perpetual victim. Lorenzo's mind immediately conjured the image of Marcus, his former business partner. Marcus possessed an almost supernatural ability to find himself in crisis situations that required immediate rescue. Whether it was gambling debts, romantic entanglements, or business ventures gone wrong, Marcus always appeared at Lorenzo's door with the same desperate expression and the same promise that this would be the last time. The manuscript explained this phenomenon with chilling precision. The perpetual victim has learned that crisis generates compassion, and compassion generates resources. They do not seek to solve their problems, they seek to monetize them. Machiavelli had observed this pattern in Renaissance courts, where certain courtiers made careers out of their misfortunes, moving from patron to patron like emotional parasites. Lorenzo remembered the progression of Marcus's requests. It began with a loan to cover unexpected medical expenses, a noble cause that triggered Lorenzo's natural impulse to help. The second request came 6 months later: gambling debts that threatened Marcus's family's safety. The third was a business investment that promised to make them both wealthy. By the 5th rescue, Lorenzo realized he was no longer helping a friend in need, he was enabling a lifestyle built on manufactured crisis. The psychological mechanism behind perpetual victimhood operates on several levels. First, these individuals develop an unconscious addiction to the rush of being saved. The dramatic rescue provides them with validation, attention, and resources without requiring the difficult work of self-improvement. Second, they begin to view their rescuers as inexhaustible resources rather than human beings with their own needs and limitations. Most destructively, perpetual victims gradually transfer responsibility for their lives onto their rescuers. When Lorenzo suggested that Marcus seek professional help for his gambling addiction, Marcus responded with wounded indignation: "I thought you were my friend. I thought you cared about me." The implied message was clear: caring meant unlimited financial support without questions or conditions. The manuscript revealed that Cesare Borgia had once warned his father, Pope Alexander VI, about a particular cardinal who specialized in this manipulation. "Your Holiness, Cardinal Santori has perfected the art of transforming his vices into our virtues. His every sin becomes our opportunity to demonstrate Christian charity, and our charity becomes his income." The Pope, recognizing the truth in his son's observation, ceased his support. Within months, the cardinal found other patrons, proving that his crises were indeed portable commodities. Lorenzo discovered that perpetual victims possess an intuitive understanding of timing and emotional leverage. They never approached during good times when their requests might seem opportunistic. Instead, they waited for moments when their targets felt generous, guilty, or emotionally vulnerable. Marcus had always timed his appeals to coincide with Lorenzo's major business successes, framing his requests as sharing in the prosperity he claimed to have helped create. The most insidious aspect of this dynamic lies in its moral complexity. These individuals rarely lie outright; instead, they present selective truths that paint them as blameless victims of circumstance. Marcus never mentioned his gambling when seeking loans for unexpected expenses. He never revealed his pattern of failed businesses when proposing new ventures. Each crisis was presented as an isolated incident, a stroke of bad luck that could happen to anyone. Breaking free from perpetual victims requires recognizing that true compassion sometimes means allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. The manuscript quoted a letter from Machiavelli to his friend Francesco Vettori: "The kindness that prevents a man from learning to walk ensures he will remain forever crawling." The second archetype, the grateful dependent. The second archetype proved even more dangerous because it wore the mask of appreciation. These individuals began as genuinely grateful recipients of help, but gradually transformed into emotional and financial dependents who used gratitude as a chain to bind their benefactors. Lorenzo recognized this pattern in his cousin Elena, whom he had helped establish her art gallery after her divorce. Initially, Elena expressed profound gratitude for his investment and support. She invited him to every exhibition opening, credited him publicly for her success, and seemed to genuinely value his guidance. For the first year, their relationship felt mutually beneficial. Lorenzo enjoyed supporting someone he loved, and Elena appeared to be thriving under his mentorship. The transformation began subtly. Elena's expressions of gratitude gradually shifted from appreciation for past help to expectations of future support. "I know how much you've invested in my success" became "I know you want to see our gallery succeed." The possessive pronoun was key. Elena had begun to view Lorenzo's support as a permanent partnership rather than temporary assistance. The manuscript detailed how Machiavelli had observed this phenomenon in the relationship between wealthy merchants and their sponsored artists in Florence. Initially grateful protégés would slowly expand their benefactors' responsibilities, arguing that protecting the initial investment required ongoing support. "They transform your generosity into your obligation," Machiavelli wrote, "making you a prisoner of your own kindness." The psychological mechanism underlying grateful dependence relies on the exploitation of sunk cost fallacy and emotional investment. Elena would regularly remind Lorenzo of how much he had already contributed, making additional requests seem like logical extensions of existing support rather than new impositions. "After everything you've invested in the gallery, I hate to ask, but," became her standard opening for financial requests. More dangerously, grateful dependents begin to interpret any reduction in support as betrayal or abandonment. When Lorenzo suggested that Elena should seek bank financing for her expansion plans rather than relying on his personal funds, she responded with hurt confusion: "I don't understand. Haven't I proven myself? Haven't I shown you that your investment was worthwhile?" The manuscript revealed that this archetype often develops in individuals who experienced early abandonment or neglect. Their genuine gratitude becomes contaminated with deep-seated fear that support will be withdrawn without warning. Rather than building independence that might risk losing their benefactor's attention, they unconsciously work to increase their benefactor's emotional and financial investment in their success. Elena exemplified this pattern perfectly. Despite her gallery's growing success, she continued to present herself as fragile and dependent on Lorenzo's guidance. She would call him for advice on decisions she was perfectly capable of making independently, not because she needed his input, but because she needed reassurance that he remained invested in her life. The most sophisticated grateful dependents learn to create artificial crises that require their benefactor's intervention. Elena would occasionally mention potential disasters, competitors trying to steal her space, difficult clients threatening lawsuits, equipment failures that could shut down exhibitions that somehow resolved themselves through mysterious last-minute interventions. Lorenzo eventually realized these crises served to remind him of Elena's vulnerability and his importance in protecting her. Breaking free from grateful dependence requires establishing clear boundaries between initial help and ongoing relationship. The manuscript advised: define the limits of your assistance before beginning, and hold to those limits as you would hold to the walls of a fortress under siege. The third archetype, the emotional terrorist. The third archetype represented the most psychologically sophisticated manipulation, individuals who weaponized emotional instability to control their environment. These people had mastered the art of creating emotional hostage situations where their mental health became everyone else's responsibility. Lorenzo's experience with Sarah, a former employee, illustrated this pattern with painful clarity. Sarah was undeniably talented, her marketing campaigns had significantly increased company revenue, but she came with emotional volatility that affected the entire office. Her moods determined the atmosphere of meetings, her reactions influenced major decisions, and her threats of self-harm paralyzed normal business operations. The manuscript described emotional terrorists as individuals who had learned that extreme emotional responses could override logical boundaries and social norms. They have discovered that the threat of their own destruction can be more powerful than any army, Machiavelli observed, for who would risk being responsible for another's self-annihilation? Sarah's pattern was devastatingly effective. Whenever she faced criticism, accountability, or consequences for poor performance, she would escalate to emotional crisis. A routine performance review would trigger tearful confessions about her struggles with depression. A missed deadline would prompt dramatic declarations about feeling overwhelmed and worthless. Most manipulatively, any attempt to establish professional boundaries would result in veiled or direct threats of self-harm. The psychological mechanism behind emotional terrorism relies on exploiting normal human compassion and fear of responsibility. When Sarah threatened to hurt herself if Lorenzo fired her for consistently missing important deadlines, she was effectively making him responsible for her life while absolving herself of responsibility for her work. The implicit message was clear: accommodate my behavior or bear the guilt of whatever happens to me. The manuscript revealed that Machiavelli had observed this dynamic in various Renaissance courts, where certain individuals used threats of suicide, exile, or dramatic gestures to manipulate powerful patrons. He noted that these individuals rarely followed through on their threats when faced with firm boundaries, suggesting that the threats were strategic rather than genuine expressions of despair. Lorenzo learned to recognize the calculated timing of Sarah's emotional crises. They invariably occurred when she faced consequences for her actions, never during neutral periods when they might seem random or genuine. Her emotional volatility had a peculiar intelligence to it, appearing precisely when it could prevent accountability or generate sympathy. The most insidious aspect of emotional terrorism lies in how it corrupts the helpers themselves. Lorenzo found himself constantly walking on eggshells around Sarah, modifying his communication style, avoiding necessary confrontations, and making exceptions to company policies. Without realizing it, he had become complicit in creating a toxic work environment where one person's emotional instability took precedence over everyone else's well-being and productivity. The manuscript warned against the common mistake of trying to cure emotional terrorists through increased understanding and support. The drowning man who grabs your leg does not seek rescue, Machiavelli wrote, he seeks company in his drowning. Additional support often reinforces these patterns rather than resolving them, as emotional terrorists learn that escalation produces resources and attention. Breaking free from emotional terrorists requires recognizing that professional and personal boundaries are not acts of cruelty but necessities for psychological health. The manuscript advised, you cannot save someone who has made their destruction a weapon against you. Your attempts at rescue become ammunition in their war against responsibility. The fourth archetype, the entitled elite. The fourth archetype emerged from a different source entirely, individuals raised in privilege who viewed others' assistance not as generosity but as natural obligation. These people possessed a refined sense of entitlement that made them particularly dangerous to those seeking to build power and influence. Lorenzo encountered this archetype in Jonathan, the son of a major client who expected Lorenzo to provide him with a high-level position in the company despite his complete lack of qualifications or work ethic. Jonathan's approach was remarkable in its assumption of inevitability. He never asked for the job, he simply discussed when he would start and what his responsibilities would be. The manuscript explained that entitled elites operate from a worldview where social hierarchies justify unlimited extraction from those they consider beneath them. They view your assistance not as gift but as tribute, Machiavelli wrote, and, like all tribute, it must be paid regularly and with increasing amounts. Jonathan exemplified this mindset perfectly. His requests for help were framed as opportunities for Lorenzo to demonstrate proper respect for social order. When Lorenzo hesitated to give him a vice president position without relevant experience, Jonathan responded with confused disappointment, I thought you understood how business relationships work. My father has given you millions in contracts. The psychological foundation of entitled entitlement runs deeper than simple arrogance. These individuals have been conditioned from birth to believe that their needs take precedence over others' boundaries. They genuinely cannot comprehend why someone would refuse to help them, viewing such refusal as evidence of moral failure or social ignorance rather than legitimate boundary setting. The manuscript revealed that Machiavelli had extensive experience with entitled nobles who viewed merchant wealth as rightfully available for their use. He observed that these individuals never developed normal reciprocity instincts because they had never experienced genuine scarcity or rejection. They are like children who have never been told no, he wrote, and, like children, they view any limitation as arbitrary cruelty. Lorenzo discovered that entitled elites possess remarkable skill at reframing their demands as mutually beneficial arrangements. Jonathan consistently presented his expectations as business opportunities that would benefit everyone involved. His lack of qualifications became fresh perspective, his inexperience became innovative thinking, and his entitlement became natural leadership ability. Most dangerously, entitled elites often possess genuine social power that makes refusing their demands costly. Jonathan's father did indeed control millions in contracts, and his disappointment in Lorenzo's lack of vision regarding his son could have serious business consequences. This created a hostage situation where Lorenzo's professional success was held ransom to Jonathan's personal advancement. The manuscript warned that entitled elites never remain satisfied with initial concessions. Jonathan's demands escalated predictably, first a position, then a higher salary than experienced employees, then decision-making authority, then exemption from normal performance standards. Each accommodation became the foundation for greater expectations rather than the source of gratitude. The most sophisticated entitled elites learned to disguise their demands as favors they're doing for their targets. Jonathan would frame his expectations as giving Lorenzo opportunities to demonstrate wisdom, loyalty, or business acumen. "I'm giving you the chance to get in early with our family's next generation," he would say, transforming his parasitism into an apparent gift. Breaking free from entitled elites requires recognizing that their worldview makes genuine reciprocity impossible. The manuscript advised, "Do not seek to educate those who view your resistance as ignorance. Their understanding of fairness will always place them at the center of all benefit." The pattern emerges as Lorenzo absorbed these first four archetypes. He began to recognize the underlying pattern that connected them all. Each type represented a different strategy for transforming other people's strengths into personal advantages. Perpetual victims weaponized compassion, grateful dependents exploited investment psychology, emotional terrorists used fear and guilt, and entitled elites leveraged social expectations. More importantly, he understood that rescuing any of these archetypes strengthened the very patterns that made them dangerous. His good intentions had been systematically converted into tools for his own manipulation and eventual destruction. The manuscript's central thesis became clear. The process of rescuing certain types of people inevitably weakened the rescuer while empowering the rescued to demand more. The ancient wisdom contained in Machiavelli's observations cut through modern psychological theories and self-help platitudes to reveal an uncomfortable truth about human nature. Some people had learned to exploit the helping instincts of others so effectively that their presence in one's life became a guarantee of diminishing power and resources. Lorenzo realized that his grandfather's business empire had been built on understanding these dynamics. The old man had been remarkably selective about whom he helped, investing his resources in people who demonstrated genuine reciprocity and capability rather than those who simply demonstrated need or cleverness in manipulation. What Lorenzo had initially interpreted as coldness was actually sophisticated pattern recognition developed through decades of experience. The manuscript promised that the remaining two archetypes would complete the picture, revealing how to identify and avoid the most dangerous manipulators while building the kind of inner strength that made external manipulation impossible. The title's promise, that destroying one's weak self made destruction by others impossible, was beginning to reveal its profound truth. The weak self that needed destroying was not personal flaws or limitations, but the naive impulses toward indiscriminate helping that made one vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation. True strength required developing the wisdom to distinguish between genuine need and strategic victimhood, between gratitude and dependence, between emotional authenticity and emotional terrorism, between respect and entitlement. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the ancient manuscript, Lorenzo prepared to absorb the final lessons that would complete his transformation from naive benefactor to unshakable force. The journey toward invulnerability was proving to be not about building walls against the world, but about developing the discrimination to know which doors should never be opened. The candles burned low in Lorenzo's study as he turned to the manuscript's most disturbing revelations. The fifth and sixth archetypes represented the apex of human manipulation, individuals so skilled at exploiting others that they could destroy lives while being thanked for their kindness. These final types would complete his understanding of why Machiavelli insisted that certain people must never be rescued, regardless of circumstances. The fifth archetype, the professional manipulator. The fifth archetype represented the most sophisticated form of human predation, individuals who had made a career out of identifying and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of successful people. Unlike the previous types, who often operated unconsciously, professional manipulators possessed a clinical understanding of human nature that they wielded with surgical precision. Lorenzo's encounter with Victoria had nearly destroyed his business empire. She had arrived as a consultant, recommended by trusted colleagues, with impressive credentials and a track record of helping companies navigate complex challenges. Her initial assessments of Lorenzo's business were remarkably insightful, identifying genuine problems and proposing elegant solutions that demonstrated deep understanding of organizational dynamics. The manuscript explained that professional manipulators always began with legitimate value delivery. They established their competence before revealing their hunger, Machiavelli wrote, for competence grants access to the victim's deeper vulnerabilities. Victoria had spent months proving her worth before beginning her real work, the systematic identification and exploitation of Lorenzo's psychological blind spots. Professional manipulators possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's deepest needs and fears. Victoria had somehow intuited that Lorenzo struggled with imposter syndrome despite his business success. She began making subtle comments about his natural leadership ability and instinctive business sense, feeding his hunger for validation while positioning herself as the person who truly understood his worth. The psychological sophistication of professional manipulators set them apart from cruder forms of exploitation. Victoria never made direct requests for money, power, or resources. Instead, she gradually repositioned herself as indispensable to Lorenzo's success and peace of mind. Her suggestions became his ideas, her presence became his confidence, and her approval became his measure of self-worth. The manuscript revealed that Machiavelli had observed this pattern in Renaissance courts, where certain advisors made themselves invaluable to princes not through loyalty or competence, but through careful management of their masters' psychological states. They become the drug that cures the insecurity they secretly create, he wrote, documenting how these advisors would subtly undermine their target's confidence while positioning themselves as the only reliable source of reassurance. Victoria's technique was masterful in its subtlety. During business meetings, she would make almost imperceptible facial expressions that suggested she disagreed with Lorenzo's decisions, but, when questioned, she would defer to his judgment with apparent reluctance. These micro-expressions planted seeds of self-doubt that bloomed into full-scale dependency on her validation. Lorenzo began seeking her approval for decisions he had confidently made for years. The most insidious aspect of professional manipulation lies in how it corrupts the victim's relationship with their own judgment. Victoria gradually trained Lorenzo to distrust his instincts while increasing his reliance on her interpretation of situations. When he felt confident about a business decision, she would subtly highlight potential risks he hadn't considered. When he felt uncertain, she would provide reassurance that came with subtle strings attached. Professional manipulators understand that true power comes not from controlling people's actions but from controlling their internal psychological states. Victoria never told Lorenzo what to do. Instead, she carefully managed his emotional and mental environment so that her preferred outcomes felt like his own authentic choices. This created the illusion of autonomy while ensuring actual dependency. The manuscript documented how these individuals often worked in teams, with one person establishing trust and competence while others gathered intelligence about the target's vulnerabilities, relationships, and resources. Victoria had seamlessly integrated herself into Lorenzo's social and professional networks, gathering information about his business, family dynamics, and personal insecurities that she could later weaponize. Breaking free from professional manipulators required recognizing that their apparent competence was often a facade covering systematic psychological exploitation. The manuscript advised, when someone seems to understand you better than you understand yourself, consider that they may be creating the confusion they claim to resolve. The sixth archetype, the moral hostage-taker, the final and most dangerous archetype, represented the ultimate in sophisticated manipulation, individuals who weaponized moral principles and social expectations to create situations where their targets couldn't refuse assistance without appearing to violate their own ethical standards. Lorenzo's experience with Father Miguel illustrated this pattern with devastating clarity. Miguel ran a charity for homeless veterans, and his requests for support were framed in terms that made refusal seem morally impossible. He never simply asked for money. Instead, he painted vivid pictures of suffering that Lorenzo's donation could prevent, creating scenarios where saying no felt like endorsing human misery. The manuscript explained that moral hostage-takers possess deep understanding of their targets' ethical frameworks and social identities. They transform your principles into their weapons, Machiavelli wrote, making your virtue the source of their power. Miguel had researched Lorenzo's public statements about social responsibility and his grandfather's philanthropic legacy, crafting appeals that perfectly aligned with Lorenzo's stated values and family history. The psychological mechanism underlying moral hostage-taking operates through the exploitation of cognitive dissonance and social identity. When Miguel presented Lorenzo with detailed accounts of veterans sleeping in freezing weather while emphasizing Lorenzo's wealth and public commitment to social causes, he created a psychological scenario where refusing help would force Lorenzo to confront an uncomfortable contradiction between his stated values and his actions. Professional moral hostage-takers like Miguel understood that successful people were particularly vulnerable to this form of manipulation because their public positions on social issues created exploitable expectations. Lorenzo's speeches about corporate responsibility became ammunition for increasingly aggressive fundraising campaigns that portrayed his company's success as morally obligating him to support Miguel's charity. The manuscript revealed that Machiavelli had observed this pattern in religious and political contexts, where certain individuals used moral authority to extract resources from those who could not afford to appear immoral or uncommitted to stated principles. They make themselves the arbiters of your righteousness, he wrote, and your righteousness becomes their revenue. Miguel's technique was particularly sophisticated because it combined genuine moral outcomes with manipulative psychological pressure. His charity did help veterans, but his fundraising methods created artificial urgency and false moral dichotomies that pressured supporters into giving more than they could afford or wanted to contribute. The good results provided cover for questionable methods. The most dangerous aspect of moral hostage-taking lies in how it corrupts the relationship between ethical action and personal autonomy. Miguel gradually trained Lorenzo to associate charitable giving not with genuine compassion but with relief from psychological pressure and social judgment. Philanthropy became a tax Lorenzo paid to maintain his social standing rather than an expression of his authentic values. Moral hostage-takers often escalate their demands by introducing additional moral complexities that make previous levels of support seem inadequate. Miguel would regularly inform Lorenzo about competing donors whose generosity made Lorenzo's contributions seem modest by comparison, or about urgent needs that required immediate response to prevent catastrophic outcomes. The manuscript warned that moral hostage-takers often possessed legitimate moral authority that made their manipulation particularly difficult to identify and resist. Miguel was genuinely helping veterans, which made questioning his methods seem petty and selfish. This created a psychological trap where the victim's discomfort with manipulation was reframed as resistance to moral obligation. Breaking free from moral hostage-takers required distinguishing between authentic ethical responsibility and manufactured moral pressure. The manuscript advised, true charity flows from abundance, not guilt. When your giving becomes payment to avoid judgment, you have stopped being generous and started being exploited. The architecture of inner strength with all 6 archetypes now revealed, Lorenzo could perceive the complete architecture of sophisticated human manipulation. Each type represented a different avenue of psychological attack, but they all shared certain common characteristics that made them identifiable to those who understood the patterns. First, they all transformed the target's strengths into vulnerabilities. Compassionate people became vulnerable to perpetual victims, generous people became vulnerable to grateful dependents, responsible people became vulnerable to emotional terrorists, successful people became vulnerable to entitled elites, insecure people became vulnerable to professional manipulators, and principled people became vulnerable to moral hostage-takers. Second, they all created escalating dependency relationships where each act of rescue required increasingly costly subsequent rescues. The initial request was always reasonable, the initial gratitude was always genuine, and the initial outcome was always positive. The trap was built from successful collaborations that gradually transformed into exploitative relationships. Third, they all possessed sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure points and social expectations that allowed them to override normal boundary-setting mechanisms. They knew exactly when to approach, what language to use, and how to frame their requests to maximize compliance while minimizing resistance. Most importantly, they all relied on their target's inability or unwillingness to distinguish between helping people and enabling destructive patterns. The manuscript's central insight became clear: true strength required developing the wisdom to recognize when compassion became complicity and when generosity became exploitation. The Death of Weakness. The manuscript's title promise that destroying one's weak self made destruction by others impossible revealed its full meaning in the context of these 6 archetypes. The weak self that required destruction was not personal inadequacy or moral failing, but the collection of unconscious assumptions and emotional reflexes that made sophisticated manipulation possible. The weak self believed that need justified entitlement, that gratitude created obligation, that emotional distress trumped rational boundaries, that social status deserved automatic deference, that competence implied trustworthiness, and that moral appeal should override personal judgment. Each of these beliefs, while potentially virtuous in isolation, became weapons in the hands of sophisticated manipulators. Lorenzo understood that destroying his weak self required rebuilding his entire framework for human interaction. He needed to develop what Machiavelli called strategic compassion, the ability to help others without being exploited by them. This meant learning to distinguish between authentic need and manufactured crisis, between gratitude and manipulation, between emotional authenticity and emotional terrorism, between genuine respect and entitlement, between competence and exploitation, between legitimate moral obligation and manufactured guilt. The process of inner transformation required accepting several uncomfortable truths about human nature. First, that some people had learned to profit from others' goodness so effectively that helping them actually enabled harm. Second, that saying no to certain types of requests was not selfishness but wisdom. Third, that true compassion sometimes required allowing people to face consequences rather than rescuing them from difficulties. Most challengingly, it required accepting that good intentions were not sufficient protection against sophisticated manipulation. The weak self wanted to believe that pure motives would attract similar purity from others, but the manuscript made clear that manipulators specifically targeted good people because their goodness made them exploitable. The fortress of discernment. The transformation from weakness to strength involved building what the manuscript called the fortress of discernment, a psychological structure that allowed one to help others without being destroyed by them. This fortress had several key components that worked together to create unshakable inner strength. First was pattern recognition, the ability to identify the 6 archetypes quickly and accurately regardless of how they presented themselves. This required studying their psychological signatures and behavioral patterns until recognition became automatic. Lorenzo practiced identifying these patterns in past relationships, current interactions, and potential future encounters until he could spot them immediately. Second was emotional regulation, the ability to resist the emotional manipulation that each archetype specialized in deploying. This meant developing immunity to guilt, pressure, flattery, threats, and moral coercion. The manuscript taught specific techniques for maintaining emotional equilibrium while under psychological attack. Third was boundary enforcement, the ability to say no clearly and maintain that position regardless of escalating pressure. This required developing internal authority that didn't depend on external validation or approval. Lorenzo learned to derive his sense of worth from his own assessment of his actions rather than from others' approval of his decisions. Fourth was strategic generosity, the ability to help people in ways that strengthened rather than weakened both parties. This meant learning to support genuine growth rather than enabling dependency, to reward character rather than need, and to invest in people's potential rather than their problems. Fifth was philosophical clarity, a clear understanding of one's own values, priorities, and responsibilities that couldn't be confused or corrupted by external pressure. This meant developing internal reference points for moral decision-making that weren't subject to manipulation by others' moral claims. The fortress of discernment created what Machiavelli called sovereign judgment, the ability to make decisions based on accurate assessment of reality rather than emotional manipulation or social pressure. Those who possessed sovereign judgment became essentially immune to the 6 archetypes because they could not be psychologically controlled or emotionally leveraged. The paradox of strength. As Lorenzo integrated these lessons, he discovered an unexpected paradox. Developing immunity to manipulation actually increased his ability to help others authentically. By refusing to enable the 6 destructive archetypes, he freed up resources and energy to support people who could benefit from assistance without becoming dependent on it. The weak self had scattered its resources across anyone who claimed need, often helping manipulators while neglecting genuinely deserving people. The strong self could focus its limited resources on individuals who would use help as a foundation for growth rather than a substitute for effort. Moreover, people who possessed the fortress of discernment attracted different types of relationships. Manipulators instinctively avoided those who couldn't be manipulated, while genuine people appreciated interacting with someone who couldn't be fooled or exploited. Strength attracted strength, while weakness attracted exploitation. The manuscript revealed that this dynamic was why successful leaders often appeared cold or calculating to those who didn't understand the necessity of strategic thinking in human relationships. They had learned through experience that indiscriminate kindness was actually a form of cruelty, cruel to themselves, cruel to the manipulators they enabled, and cruel to the genuine people they neglected while being exploited. The complete transformation promised by the manuscript was beginning to manifest in Lorenzo's life. He was becoming someone who could not be destroyed by others because he had destroyed the psychological vulnerabilities that made destruction possible. The weak self that believed in the goodness of all people had been replaced by the strong self that could accurately assess the motivations and capabilities of individuals. 6 months after discovering Machiavelli's manuscript, Lorenzo stood transformed. The naive benefactor who had once scattered his resources across anyone claiming need had been replaced by a man of discerning strength who could not be manipulated, exploited, or destroyed by others. The promise of the ancient text had been fulfilled. Through destroying his weak self, he had become invulnerable to external destruction. The new reality, the transformation, manifested in every aspect of Lorenzo's life with startling clarity. Former parasites who had once drained his energy and resources found themselves unable to penetrate his new psychological defenses. Marcus, the perpetual victim, had attempted his usual crisis-driven appeals only to be met with calm refusal and suggestions for professional help. When his escalating emotional manipulations failed to produce the expected resources, he had quietly disappeared to find more vulnerable targets. Elena, the grateful dependent, had initially been confused by Lorenzo's new boundaries around their relationship. Her subtle expectations of continued financial and emotional support were met with clear statements about the limits of his involvement in her business. When she attempted to leverage their family connection and her past gratitude to maintain the dependency dynamic, Lorenzo remained unmoved. Eventually, she was forced to develop genuine independence, and, paradoxically, their relationship became more authentic and mutually respectful. Sarah, the emotional terrorist, had found her psychological weapons completely ineffective against Lorenzo's new emotional regulation skills. Her threats and emotional volatility no longer triggered his rescue instincts or guilt responses. When she realized that her emotional crises would not prevent professional consequences or generate special treatment, she either modified her behavior or removed herself from situations where her manipulation techniques were useless. Jonathan, the entitled elite, discovered that his assumed social privileges carried no weight with someone who understood the true nature of power relationships. Lorenzo's polite but firm refusal to provide unearned opportunities was delivered without apology or explanation, making it clear that entitlement would not be rewarded regardless of social expectations or potential consequences. Victoria, the professional manipulator, had encountered something she rarely faced: complete immunity to her sophisticated psychological techniques. Lorenzo's new ability to trust his own judgment and resist external validation made her manipulation attempts not only ineffective but obvious. She had withdrawn from his circle when it became clear that her presence was no longer welcome or profitable. Father Miguel, the moral hostage-taker, found that his ethical appeals no longer produced the automatic compliance he had come to expect. Lorenzo had developed the ability to separate genuine moral responsibility from manufactured guilt, contributing to charitable causes based on his own assessment of worth rather than psychological pressure or social expectations. The science of invulnerability. The manuscript had taught Lorenzo that true invulnerability was not about building walls against the world, but about developing the internal systems that made manipulation impossible. These systems operated on multiple levels, creating a comprehensive defense against the full spectrum of human exploitation. The first level was perceptual, the ability to see reality clearly without the distorting influence of emotion, guilt, or social pressure. Lorenzo had learned to observe behavior patterns rather than listening to explanations, to notice actions rather than believing words, and to track results rather than accepting intentions. This perceptual clarity made it impossible for manipulators to create the psychological confusion they relied on for their effectiveness. The second level was emotional, complete regulation of his internal states independent of external manipulation attempts. Lorenzo had developed what the manuscript called emotional sovereignty, the ability to choose his responses to situations rather than reacting automatically to psychological triggers. This meant that guilt, fear, flattery, anger, and other emotional manipulations simply didn't produce the intended effects. The third level was philosophical, a clear understanding of his own values, priorities, and responsibilities that couldn't be corrupted by external moral pressure. Lorenzo had developed his own ethical framework based on long-term consequences and mutual benefit rather than short-term emotional appeals or social expectations. This philosophical clarity made moral hostage-taking impossible because his moral reasoning couldn't be hijacked by others' claims about right and wrong. The fourth level was social, the ability to maintain his position and decisions regardless of social pressure, relationship dynamics, or threatened consequences. Lorenzo had learned that most social pressure was manipulative rather than legitimate, and that people who threatened to withdraw their approval or support based on his boundary setting were revealing their exploitative intentions. The fifth level was strategic, the ability to think several moves ahead in human interactions, anticipating manipulation attempts and preparing effective responses. This strategic thinking allowed him to avoid situations where manipulation was likely and to structure his relationships in ways that discouraged exploitative behavior. The art of strategic relationships. With his new understanding of human nature and manipulation, Lorenzo had completely restructured his approach to relationships. Instead of the indiscriminate openness that had previously made him vulnerable, he now practiced what Machiavelli called strategic intimacy, the careful calibration of trust, resources, and emotional investment based on demonstrated character and mutual benefit. The manuscript had revealed that successful leaders throughout history maintained different categories of relationships, each with appropriate boundaries and expectations. Lorenzo now classified his relationships into 5 distinct categories, each requiring different levels of involvement and different protective measures. The first category consisted of true allies, individuals who had demonstrated consistent character, genuine reciprocity, and alignment with his values over extended periods. These relationships received the highest levels of trust and investment because they were based on mutual strength rather than dependency or manipulation. True allies enhanced each other's power and capabilities rather than draining them. The second category included transactional partners, people with whom he maintained mutually beneficial professional or social relationships without deeper emotional investment. These relationships were governed by clear agreements and measurable outcomes, making manipulation difficult because expectations were explicit and accountability was built into the structure. The third category encompassed casual contacts, acquaintances with whom he maintained polite but limited interaction. These relationships received minimal emotional or financial investment and were structured to prevent the development of dependency or manipulation dynamics. The fourth category contained monitored risks, individuals who had demonstrated some concerning patterns but hadn't yet revealed themselves as belonging to one of the 6 destructive archetypes. These relationships received careful observation and strict boundaries while Lorenzo gathered more information about their true nature. The fifth category consisted of identified threats, people who clearly belonged to one or more of the 6 archetypes and who represented active dangers to his well-being and success. These individuals received minimal interaction and maximum protection against their manipulation attempts, with the eventual goal of complete disconnection when possible. This strategic approach to relationships allowed Lorenzo to invest his limited time, energy, and resources where they would produce the greatest positive returns while protecting himself from the psychological and financial drainage that characterized his previous approach to human connection. The multiplication of power. One of the most surprising discoveries of Lorenzo's transformation was how developing immunity to manipulation actually multiplied his effective power in all areas of life. The energy and resources previously lost to exploitation were now available for genuine growth and achievement. The mental bandwidth previously consumed by managing manipulative relationships was now focused on productive activities. More importantly, his reputation as someone who could not be manipulated began attracting a higher quality of people and opportunities. Other strong individuals sought him out for collaboration because they recognized his ability to maintain boundaries and think strategically about relationships. Business partners valued his inability to be emotionally leveraged during negotiations. Employees respected his consistent and rational decision-making process. The manuscript had predicted this outcome, explaining that strength attracts strength while weakness attracts exploitation. Lorenzo's transformation had shifted him from the category of people who were seen as resources to be exploited to the category of people who were seen as valuable allies to be courted. This shift fundamentally changed the quality of opportunities and relationships available to him. His business empire began expanding rapidly as he applied his new understanding of human nature to hiring decisions, partnership agreements, and client relationships. By refusing to work with individuals who demonstrated the 6 destructive archetypes, he built an organization composed entirely of people who contributed more than they consumed. This created a positive feedback loop where success attracted more success. The deeper philosophy. As months passed, Lorenzo began to understand that the manuscript's lessons extended far beyond practical relationship management into fundamental questions about human nature, morality, and the structure of society itself. Machiavelli's insights revealed uncomfortable truths about how civilized society actually operated beneath its surface claims about cooperation and mutual benefit. The 6 archetypes existed because society generally rewarded their behavior patterns through misguided concepts of compassion, obligation, and moral duty. Well-meaning people enabled destructive behavior by conflating helping with kindness and boundary setting with cruelty. This created a perverse incentive structure where manipulation was more profitable than genuine contribution, and dependency was more rewarded than strength. Lorenzo realized that his transformation was not just personal but philosophical. He had moved from a worldview based on naive optimism about human nature to one based on clear-eyed assessment of human motivations and capabilities. This didn't make him cynical or misanthropic, but it did make him realistic about the necessity of discernment in human relationships. The manuscript revealed that this philosophical shift was essential for anyone seeking to build lasting power and influence. Leaders who maintained naive views about human nature inevitably fell victim to sophisticated manipulation, while those who understood the full spectrum of human behavior could structure their environments to promote genuine cooperation while preventing exploitation. The responsibility of strength. With great power came great responsibility, but Lorenzo discovered that the responsibility of strength was different from the obligation of weakness. The weak self had felt responsible for everyone's needs and problems, leading to the enabling of destructive behavior and the neglect of genuine opportunities to help. The strong self felt responsible for using power wisely and for creating systems that rewarded character while discouraging manipulation. Lorenzo began using his immunity to manipulation to help others develop similar capabilities. He shared the manuscript's insights with trusted allies, taught boundary-setting skills to employees, and modeled strategic compassion in his business and personal relationships. His strength became a foundation for helping others become stronger rather than more dependent. The manuscript had warned against the common mistake of trying to rescue people who belonged to the 6 destructive archetypes, but it encouraged helping people who demonstrated genuine desire for growth and capability for independence. Lorenzo learned to identify individuals who could benefit from assistance without becoming dependent on it, and to structure his help in ways that built character rather than enabling weakness. This approach to helping others created a multiplication effect where his strength enhanced the strength of others rather than being drained by them. The people he helped became allies and contributors rather than dependents and drains, creating an expanding network of mutually supportive relationships. The final integration. As his first year of transformation concluded, Lorenzo reflected on the complete restructuring of his understanding of power, relationships, and human nature. The weak self that had once scattered resources across anyone claiming need had been replaced by the strong self that could accurately assess the motivations and capabilities of others while maintaining emotional and financial boundaries that protected his ability to help genuinely deserving people. The 6 archetypes that had once seemed like unfortunate people deserving assistance now revealed themselves as sophisticated predators who had learned to exploit the helping instincts of others. Understanding their patterns and techniques had made him essentially immune to their influence while freeing up resources for authentic relationships and meaningful assistance. Most importantly, he had achieved the manuscript's central promise: by destroying his weak self, he had become invulnerable to destruction by others. The psychological vulnerabilities that made manipulation possible had been eliminated and replaced with discernment, emotional regulation, clear boundaries, and strategic thinking. The legacy of transformation: the manuscript had transformed Lorenzo from a target of manipulation into a force of nature, someone who could not be psychologically controlled, emotionally leveraged, or strategically outmaneuvered by those who sought to exploit others' goodness for personal gain. This transformation had multiplied his effectiveness in every area of life while attracting higher quality relationships and opportunities. More broadly, Lorenzo understood that he had joined a small percentage of people who truly understood how power operated in human relationships. This understanding carried obligations to use power wisely, to protect others from manipulation when possible, and to create systems that rewarded genuine contribution over sophisticated parasitism. The weak self dies hard in most people because it provides the illusion of moral superiority through indiscriminate compassion. The strong self requires the uncomfortable acceptance that not all people deserve help and that some forms of assistance actually enable harm. But, for those willing to make this philosophical transition, the rewards include not just immunity to manipulation but the multiplication of genuine power and the ability to create authentic positive change in the world. Lorenzo closed the ancient manuscript knowing that his transformation was complete, but his application of its lessons would continue for the rest of his life. He had learned the deepest secret of power: that those who cannot be destroyed by others are those who have destroyed their own weaknesses first. The fortress of discernment would protect him forever, while the crown of sovereignty would enable him to build something far greater than personal invulnerability, a legacy of strength that would outlast his own lifetime. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, for he has eliminated the psychological vulnerabilities that make destruction possible. In their place stands someone immune to manipulation, clear in judgment, strategic in action, and powerful in ways that multiply rather than diminish over time. This is the ultimate gift of Machiavelli's ruthless wisdom: not just protection from predators, but transformation into a force that creates strength in others while remaining forever unshakable himself.